morning and welcome to Veterans Legal Lowdown. My name is Nicholas Briggs and today I'm joined by Kevin Medeiros and Michelle DeTore. And we're going to be talking about secondary conditions related to conditions that are presumptively related to Agent Orange. So first, before we get started, it would be helpful to provide a brief description of what Agent Orange is and how it's relevant to today's discussion. So Agent Orange is one of several so-called rainbow herbicides used during the Vietnam War era. The United States military used Agent Orange and other herbicides like it to deforest large areas of land in Vietnam in order to disrupt enemy supply lines and prevent ambushes. Agent Orange itself is a 50-50 mixture of two different kinds of herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. Agent Orange also contained the contaminant TCDD as a byproduct of its production. TCDD, which is short for 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, is the most toxic of all dioxins, and as a result of that toxicity, many veterans who served during the Vietnam War era were in direct contact with the chemical and have developed a range of health conditions as a result. And not only have they developed these primary conditions, they've developed secondary conditions as well, which we'll talk a bit more about later. So Michelle, first, can you tell us a bit about how a veteran is known to have been exposed to Agent Orange?
Yeah. So VA acknowledges presumptive exposure for veterans with active military, naval, air, or space service during the following periods of time and locations. So you have January 1962 to May 1975 in the Republic of Vietnam. You have January 1962 to June 1976 in Thailand. You have December 1965 to September 1969 in Laos. You have April 1969 to April 1969 in Cambodia. You have January 1962 to July 1980 in Guam or American Sonoma. You have January 1972 to September 1977 at Johnston Atoll. You have September 1967 to August 1971 in the Korean DMZ. And you generally have 1969 to 1986 when it comes to the C-123 aircrafts. Now, keep in mind, I gave general months and years. There are actual day specific as well. So that's just something to be mindful of when you are looking at timeframes for presumptive exposure.
And another important thing to note is they don't all automatically line up with the Vietnam War era. That's generally what we're talking about. But for Thailand, for example, that was recently added as a presumption in the PACT Act, on which we filmed several videos. And the Thailand presumptive window actually extends almost a full year longer than the Vietnam War era. And that's just meant to reflect that veterans served in Thailand longer than they were in Vietnam itself. So now that we know a bit more about where veterans might have been exposed to Agent Orange, Kevin, can you fill us in on some of the primary conditions that can develop as a result of this exposure?
Yeah, sure. And VA considers this following list of conditions if a veteran has been exposed to Agent Orange and develops these conditions as presumptive. They are AL amyloidosis, which is a rare disease that causes the bone marrow cells to mutate and usually affects the heart and the kidneys. Bladder cancer, chronic B-cell leukemias, chloracne, which is a skin disorder, diabetes type 2, Hodgkin's disease, hypertension, hypothyroidism, ischemic heart disease. A new one is monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, which is abnormal proteins in the blood. Multiple myeloma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Parkinson's disease, Parkinson's-like symptoms, peripheral neuropathy, porphyria cutanea tarda, which is another skin condition, prostate cancer, respiratory cancer, and soft tissue sarcomas. Like I mentioned, that monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance has been newly added to the presumptive list as part of the PACT Act, and so has hypertension. So for more information on the PACT Act, including new toxic exposure presumptions, we have a video about that on our website.
Great. Thanks for that, Kevin. So with that in mind, we have a good sense of many of the conditions that are primarily related to Agent Orange exposure. But that's not often where things leave off, unfortunately. After veterans have suffered from these primary conditions for many years, it's common for them to start developing secondary disabilities as they attempt to treat that primary condition. So when it comes to secondary service connection, it is describing a condition that develops or is the result of a condition that's already service connected. And in proving claims for secondary service connection, veterans often still need to provide medical nexus in a way that they didn't need to for the presumptive conditions, because the important part of those presumptions is that the medical nexus, the relationship between Agent Orange and the condition itself, is assumed. Whereas with these secondary conditions, you still need to prove medical nexus, though that is often easier because the medical community widely recognizes certain conditions as being obviously secondary to diabetes and other disabilities like it. So first, we'll start off with the primary example, which is diabetes mellitus type 2. It was added to the list of presumptive conditions back in May of 2001. And one of the most common residuals and secondary disabilities related to diabetes is peripheral neuropathy. Peripheral neuropathy affects the veteran's peripheral nerves and can cause numbness, weakness, pain, and tingling in both the upper and lower extremities, though oftentimes this numbness and weakness is largely confined to the feet and the hands. And veterans can be service-connected for peripheral neuropathy either secondary to their diabetes. However, if they had early onset neuropathy shortly after their exposure, the regulations do technically allow for neuropathy to be service-connected based off of the Agent Orange exposure itself. So in addition to peripheral neuropathy as a common secondary disability to diabetes, we see other conditions as well, including diabetic retinopathy, erectile dysfunction, and chronic kidney disease. Michelle, are there any other examples that we can highlight for secondary disabilities?
Yeah, unfortunately, one we see very commonly, which Nick briefly mentioned, was that we see erectile dysfunction secondary to prostate cancer. While erectile dysfunction typically gets a non-compensable rating, veterans who are service-connected for this condition are likely eligible to receive special monthly compensation at the K level, which is usually about an extra $100, $120, depends on the cost of living, but adjustment for each year. But currently that's the range right now. It's in addition to their monthly benefit. Also, which was very common with prostate cancer, is when originally service-connected and the cancer is active, it's 100%. After that, it's usually rated based on urinary frequency and urinary incontinence. So you'll see that you'll be compensated for that as an unfortunate side effect of prostate cancer.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. And it's important to highlight cancers generally because those are many of the conditions that have been presumptively linked to herbicide exposure over the years. And more cancers are being added to that list all the time. Bladder cancer, for example, was recently added back in 2020. So with that in mind, are there any other common conditions, Kevin, that might be associated with cancer that a veteran could potentially get granted as secondary to that condition?
Yeah, a big one we see is depression. So it's common for veterans with cancer to start suffering from depression as a result of the negative effects of the disease on their life, the treatments, and everything they have to go through associated with having the cancer. So for veterans, they can file for secondary service connection for depression, and it's helpful in those cases for veterans to provide lay statements from family and friends who can attest to the onset and progression of their depression in relation to the cancer, which like I said, is pretty common.
Thanks, Kevin. Another thing to keep in mind when talking about presumptive service-connected conditions and Agent Orange exposure is that many of the conditions on the list are relatively systemic in terms of how they affect the veteran. So certain diseases like Parkinson's disease itself, as well as other types of Parkinsonism, can have widespread effects on the person's body that can result in many different types of impairment, all of which can be considered as secondary residuals of that primary Parkinson's disease. Oftentimes we see veterans with Parkinson's developing forms of upper and lower extremity neuropathy and tremor disorders. They often have difficulty swallowing, difficulty speaking. They develop urinary frequency and urinary bladder control issues. And many other residual conditions can be associated with that one primary condition. So it's critical for veterans to recognize all of the problems that they're having and report them to both their medical doctors and their C&P examiners. That way, anything that could potentially be related to Parkinson's or systemic disease like it can be rated, because they might not necessarily know that this condition or that condition is related to their Parkinson's itself. But another thing to keep in mind is that not only do conditions, primary disabilities, cause secondary conditions, but unfortunately sometimes medications to treat the primary condition can cause disability as well. Are there any examples that come to mind, Michelle, that you think might be helpful?
I think there is. I think this is also an interesting one because I think it's often overlooked as a potential. So a lot of times medication side effects can cause anything from headaches, you have gastroesophageal problems like GERD, you have IBS, it could cause that. I think that another thing that is very common is not understanding that it didn't necessarily need to cause it, but it can also aggravate it. So you could have had GERD beforehand, but now the medication is making it worse. You could have had IBS, but a side effect of the medication is diarrhea, and now you're having flare-ups more frequently of your IBS. I think that those are things to really be thinking about when you are, seeking service connection, is also looking at the medication side effects, and not only the general side effects, but if the medication is now worsening a condition that you might have had prior.
And another good example of this is additional disability and aggravated disability that might arise as a result of chemotherapy. Like we've talked about before, many cancers are on the list of presumptive diseases related to Agent Orange, and chemotherapy is used to treat many of those cancers. And it can have widespread negative effects, including neuropathy and many other disabilities like it. So even the treatment for your condition itself can potentially cause disability. And again, if those problems do arise, just make sure that you're reporting them to your doctor and to your VA examiners. That way, VA has the information they need to rate your disability appropriately. So with that in mind, with the idea of rating disabilities appropriately, another thing that often comes up in our line of work in representing disabled veterans is the idea of unemployability benefits. And oftentimes, while the cancer itself may not stop a veteran from working, it's certainly possible that the conditions they develop as secondary to their primaries can cause them to stop working in one way or another. So, Kevin, can you tell us a bit more about secondary conditions and their overlap on the potential entitlement for TDIU?
Sure. Yeah. Secondary conditions can really go a long way to increase a veteran's overall combined rating. And the higher a veteran's overall combined rating, the more likely VA is to grant TDIU. TDIU stands for Total Disability based on Individual Unemployability. So it recognizes that a veteran is unable to obtain and maintain substantially gainful employment because of their service-connected conditions. And a grant of TDIU will compensate a veteran at the 100% level, even if their overall combined rating isn't 100%. Under the VA regulations, there's a scheduler TDIU, which is when one service-connected condition is rated at 60% minimum, or two conditions or more that can be combined to reach 70% if one condition alone is rated at 40%. So the scheduler TDIU criteria are outlined in 38 CFR 4.16a. And like I said, if a veteran meets that criteria, VA is more likely to grant TDIU, but it's not necessary. Veterans are also may be eligible for extra scheduler TDIU if they don't meet those percentage thresholds. If they can show that their service-connected conditions nevertheless preclude them from working.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you all for joining us today. If you're interested in obtaining more information on Agent Orange, VA presumptions, and service connection, both primary and secondary service connection, all of that information can be found on our website. Please also be sure to check out our other videos and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for tuning in.